Hi, I'm Miranda Cichy from the University of Glasgow, and today I'll be talking about the Endling in Extinction narratives. On 1st of September 1914 at 1 p.m, a pigeon was found dead on the floor of her enclosure in Cincinnati Zoo. Her mate had died 4 years previously, and the pair had not produced offspring. Her body was quickly packed in ice and shipped to the National Museum in Washington, D.C., now the Smithsonian, arriving 3 days later. Her skin was removed to be stuffed and mounted. Later, the osteologist and ornithologist R.W. Shufelt conducted an autopsy on her internal organs, the report of which was published in the Auk. It included a long preamble, including the exact time the bird arrived at his home and the size of the photographs taken of her. This was no ordinary autopsy. Shufelt was aware that the pigeon before him was the last living representative of its race in the world, the very last, of the millions upon millions of those birds which had passed over the United States in the previous centuries, the final passenger pigeon. Shufelt didn't name the bird in the autopsy, referring to her as it, but she had been hatched in the zoo's gardens 3 decades previously and was named Martha, after the wife of the first US president. Her mate was George. Although in the early 1900s the word hadn't yet been coined, Martha was an Endling, the last individual of a species before it goes extinct. Originally devised in 1996 to refer to humans in a convalescent centre who were the last of their lineage, the term Endling now refers specifically to animals. Many species have and will become extinct without a known named Endling. We may become aware of the Endling posthumously, for instance after the last captive thylacine died in a zoo in Hobart, Tasmania, and failure to locate another animal was understood as confirmation of extinction. Often referred to as Benjamin, it's likely that this thylacine Endling name, and possibly the animal's sex, was also created posthumously. Actual known Endlings are quite rare, and what I'm going to look at today is how they can feature in extinction narratives, alive, dead, real, or imagined. Passenger pigeons were once so plentiful in North America that passing flocks were said to block out the light. In 1860, a naturalist estimated that he saw one containing 3 billion birds. Such abundance led to exploitation. Initially, the passenger pigeon was an important food source for early settlers, but later the multiple corpses were fed to pigs or used as fertilizer. Birds were shot, trapped with birdlime, and suffocated, while their nests were knocked from trees in order to gather the squabs. Their forest habitat and source of the beech mast, acorns, and chestnuts that sustained them was felled for timber, in addition to free up land for crops. Population decline was rapid. The last bird in the wild was killed in 1900, and by summer 1910 there was only Martha in Cincinnati Zoo. Martha was known as her species Endling and exhibited in a Japanese-style pagoda. Children hand-fed her peanuts, and as she grew older, the area around her enclosure was roped off to prevent the public from throwing sand to make her move. Some were regular visitors. In the 1980s, a journalist interviewed a man who had visited Martha frequently at the zoo as a child. Talking about her death 70 years later still made him emotional. As a visible Endling, she both embodied and personalized imminent and inevitable extinction, and she has been the subject of books, poems, songs, art, and statues. The visual impact of Martha as an Endling didn't end with her death. Her organs remain in storage, but her taxidermy body became a key specimen for the Smithsonian, and she has been exhibited in various ways over the past century. Through the Smithsonian website, you can explore a 360-degree view of Martha's taxidermy form via photographs taken on the centenary of her death in 2014. Female passenger pigeons were duller than the males, and Martha is not evidently the blue bird that the species was nicknamed. She has various shades of brown and grey, except for the salmon-coloured legs and feet, which would have been painted and retouched by taxidermists. At the time of her death, They were a deep flesh-coloured pink. Taxidermy inhabits the uneasy ground between animal and object, between life and death. It strives for realness, and typically anonymity, conjuring up a sense of the species, not the individual, representing what Donna Haraway called the unblemished type specimen. But as taxidermy Endling, Martha's individuality was to be celebrated. The queues of people who had visited her alive could now visit her dead. And perhaps for some, the difference between these two experiences was not so great. Her body had become a poignant symbol of her species and its extinction, distinct from the other 1,500 passenger pigeon specimens that exist globally. A question with extinction taxidermy is whether the presence of lifelike bodies negates our sense of the species' total absence. In Kelly Enright's article on monuments to passenger pigeons, where she considers Martha's body one such monument, Enright believes that the bird's corporeality challenges the species' absence, although there seems to be some contradiction in her claim that viewers could imagine away extinction even as they were faced with its glass-eyed gaze. But in taxidermy, context is key. In its stuffed and mounted state, Martha's body is a semi-fixed thing. Her wings and beak cannot be manipulated open. Her head will not turn. It is thus the presentation of her body that directs the narrative. Enright writes only briefly of Martha's appearance at the 2014 Smithsonian exhibition, Once There Were Billions, Vanished Birds of North America. Dolly Jorgensen gives a fuller account of this display. 3 passenger pigeons were displayed in front of an illustration of a passenger pigeon hunt. Martha was mounted alongside a male who was offering her a seed in his beak. Alongside them was a third bird, a skin, an unmounted specimen, lying belly up, and without the glass or plastic eyes to provide the semblance of a gaze, what Rachel Poliquin terms the thingness of taxidermy. For Jorgensen, this eyeless skin embodied the death of the passenger pigeon, while the seeming liveliness of Martha and her mate, and the backdrop, suggested they would be next to die. But Martha's place in this diorama is fiction. She was never at risk of large-scale passenger pigeon hunts. The Latin name Ectopes migratorius translates as the wandering migrant, or the more poetic wandering wanderer. For much of her life, Martha wandered no further than the confines of her cage, the designated representative of a species whose way of life she had not experienced. Even those few thousand wild birds in the late 1800s were living in an entirely different way to how their billions of ancestors had lived for millennia. Tom Van Doren argues that the loss of such enormous flocks would have broken down what it was to be a passenger pigeon in some fundamental sense. Van Doren also disputes using an Endling as the focus of an extinction narrative, contending that the notion of a last individual suggests a species is ongoing, even when it is functionally extinct, and to focus on that individual's death is therefore reductive. Martha never experienced a nomadic existence or flew in the middle of a sky-obscuring flock, yet she has become a strange form of synecdoche, standing in for a whole that is iconic precisely because it was so far from single. Extinction is a huge concept, both temporally and spatially. An evolutionary thread is severed, ending the millennia of development that preceded the animal's demise and short-circuiting what it might have become. But it's hard to emotionally connect to these individual years and animals that have been lost, as hard as it is perhaps to imagine a flock of 3 billion birds. As a narrative device, an Endling provides a name, an individual life story, and in Martha's case, a time-stamped death, a focus. The need for focus engenders Endling narratives, even when there is no such known individual. Fred Bodsworth's 1954 novella, The Last of the Curlews, fictionalizes the migratory journey of one of the world's last Eskimo curlews from Patagonia to the Arctic. Passages are interspliced with scientific extracts on the bird and its declining populations. Centering on the journey's perils, the narrative repeatedly emphasizes the curlew's loneliness, combined with the strong pull of his instinct to find a mate. 2/3 into the book, Having never seen another of his own kind, he finds her. Their courtship and companionship dominate the final part of their journey to Canada, building from tenderness to passion. But at the point that the ecstasy of mating occurs in the field, the pair are shot at by a farmer. Although the narrative naturally veers into anthropomorphism, it strives to present the curlew's point of view, and there is no mention of guns. To the confused bird, the violent act seems like thunder from a clear sky. The female's wing is hit, and on the final page of the book, she dies. The story ends with the male curlew alone once more, protecting his territory in the Arctic tundra for the female his instinct told him soon would come. Bodsworth's novella was speculative in several ways. The Eskimo curlew has not been declared extinct, and the last confirmed sighting occurred in the 1960s, a decade after the book's publication. It also proved hugely popular and remains an ongoing potential Endling narrative, not completely without hope, but warning that if the last of the curlews still exists, we will be unlikely to know of or prevent its demise. In The Song of the Dodo, a study of island biogeographies and extinction, David Quammen's imagining of the death of the last dodo is far bleaker. Quammen is aware that this individual death is less ecologically significant than the factors that have led to the species' demise. But he nonetheless narrates the imagined end of the single survivor, using what Ursula Heiser describes as well-worn elegiac cliches, a female whose children and eggs have been eaten by invasive mammals and whose mate has been killed by a sailor. Quammen's dodo Endling can no longer run or see properly. She dies alone and miserable in a storm, unaware that she's the last of her kind. The dodo is, as Heiser observes, both real and symbolic, an imagined figure whose species extinction is painfully factual. Like Bodsworth's female curlew dying during copulation, Quammen cannot resist heightening the poignancy of death, using the pathetic fallacy of the storm to emphasize the misery of extinction. But this emotive narrative potential is the benefit of imagined endlings. Unlike Martha, they're not simply found dead in the base of their cage. In 2017, the taxidermy passenger pigeon endling reappeared in the Smithsonian's Objects of Wonder exhibition. Gone were the dioramas and other specimens. This time, Martha was exhibited alone, on a branch in a plain display case, next to a small board explaining the passenger pigeon's extinction. Here, the bird once nicknamed Blue Meteor is exhibited alongside the Blue Flame, one of the world's largest lapis lazuli gemstones. In this exhibition, Martha is not so much a reminder of extinction as one of the museum's treasures. The 2 sentences on her plaque refer solely to the time and location of her death and her post-death preservation. Removed from her life, as an endling, she has passed her status as animal and then animal-made object into object only, an artifact, a static monument to her species. But Martha is not in stasis. Taxidermy's sense of residual liveliness rests on the fact that it is made from the skin of the dead animal that it depicts. And to look further, the liveliness of this skin, its potential to crack, fade, and decay, can lead to the object animal no longer looking as alive as it once did. Even in the protected museum environment, it is vulnerable to forces that may accelerate this decay, including water, pests, pollutants, light, and temperature. Martha's dissector found the bird in fine condition in 1914, and she has been preserved well. But in the 2014 photographs, she has lost some of her shine, her head feathers patchy, her tail feathers crinkling. Objects of Wonder is due to close later this year, and as a treasure, Martha will likely be then returned to the storerooms. In 2018, the Wall Street Journal quoted the de-extinction scientist Ben Novak, saying she was in bad shape. But perhaps displaying her in this state to the public would be a fitting tribute to Ectopis migratorius. The quiet forces of decay, invisible to the eye, will slowly eat, fade, and dissolve the aging taxidermy endling over time. In this final narrative, the idea that taxidermy can preserve an animal forever would be unraveled by Martha's tattered form, and the endling would be able to meet the fate of others before her, an individual pigeon once more. Such exposure of her body's vulnerability would illustrate the ongoing passage of time following the species extinction, a story of Martha's life and death as Endling, but also to what she marked, the erasure of the passenger pigeon. Thank you very much.